With America's 250th coming up, it seemed appropriate to try and tell Ohio's part of that story, and we pitched the idea of doing that through 250 objects.
It's the Decorative Arts Center of Ohio, so we tried to focus on decorative arts objects, so that would be things like furniture and pottery and glass and those sorts of things. And we were trying to cover literally the whole gamut of Ohio history. We've got some natural history things, but also early indigenous life, all the way up through our newest object was something that was just printed at the end of last year. So it's thousands of years of history in one exhibition.
It wasn't practical to go chronologically, so the exhibition is thematic. We tried to think broadly about topics and then gather them together in groupings that made sense for the galleries.
So in this first gallery, it's resources, and so we have a variety of objects that all speak to those natural and human resources that helped form the foundation and the later growth of the state. Ohio means between waters. We have Lake Erie and the Ohio River. We have some wonderful maps of the Ohio River and images of the Ohio River. You just can't overstate the importance of the water in terms of the development of Ohio and the expansion of the early American nation. Most of these bottles were made in Zanesville in the 1820s, 30s, and maybe early 40s. Glass was such a huge industry early on because 10,000 years ago, as the glaciers were pushing to the southeast in Ohio, they were scraping the ground and pushing all sorts of material that deposited in this part of Ohio, and one of those was silica, and silica is the foundation for glass. So in the 19th century, when American settlers first crossed the mountains into what is now Ohio, passenger pigeons were so numerous that there are reports of flocks of them literally blocking out the sun for hours. But by the early 20th century, they had been completely wiped out. And this is a passenger pigeon that was a taxidermy mount from more than 100 years ago that is actually on loan from our neighbors, the Fairfield Heritage Association.
This gallery is the People Gallery. Ohio's had so many famous people, inventors and politicians and creators. But in looking into it, there are also people whose stories have kind of, I think, don't necessarily get the full weight. And one of those people was a woman named Jane Edna Hunter. Ms. Hunter was born in South Carolina, born in 1882, limited opportunities for an African-American woman after the war. She had the opportunity to get the equivalent of an 8th grade education. Her dad died young. She was cleaning houses to support the family. She was forced into what sounds like a pretty terrible marriage to a man who was 30 or 40 years older. And she somehow got loose and made her way to Cleveland, land of opportunity. But when she arrived there, she realized there were no places for young black women. There was no housing. And so she and a few of her friends that she had made, other young black women in Cleveland who were pursuing careers, got together and formed a working girls association. Fast forwarding, by 1925, she had passed the Ohio bar, gotten involved in Ohio real estate. She fundraised relentlessly, and she ended up with an 11-story building that for a long time was primarily dedicated to offering safe, affordable, clean housing to young women of color. They are now known as the Phyllis Wheatley Association. They still own that property and the little house that Ms. Hunter lived in next door. And it has now converted to being an elder care facility, but it continues to serve the community that she built it in. They offered affordable daycare and art classes and dance and music lessons, all sorts of things over the years. And it's just a great example of how, to me, how one person with a vision of how to make their community better really managed to transform so many people's lives for the better. Another one of the great stories in the exhibition is a bed made by Henry Boyd of Cincinnati. Henry Boyd was born in Kentucky in 1802 and had an opportunity that lots of times was not given to people who were enslaved. He was able to work and earn his freedom, and he was an experienced woodworker. He relocated to Cincinnati, north of the river, and he opened his own woodworking shop. At one point in time, he was making over 1,000 beds a year. What made them special was he actually had a design that allowed the rail is threaded on the ends, and it's threaded in opposite directions. So when you twist it to tighten, it simultaneously tightens at both ends. He operated his own shop in Cincinnati in the 1850s and 60s, which was quite unprecedented for the time. He ran an integrated shop, usually had 20 to 50 workers on staff. He was also very active in the Underground Railroad in Cincinnati, and his craftsmanship allowed him to create really inventive, well-hidden spots.
So this chair was made just before the Civil War, and during at least some of the Civil War, it was used by General Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant, in his early days during the Mexican War, was a quartermaster, and he understood that the success of an army depended on its ability to acquire supplies. So after the war, to reward one of his quartermasters, he presented him with this chair.
This piece is Mother's Day by Ludi McGuffey Manahan, an Ohio artist. A lot of Ludis are interior scenes like this, family scenes, and I just love this depiction of kind of a subtle nod to mother's life, complete chaos, cats on the table, babies crying, elderly people that need caretaking, and dad's at the door with his bag. And so there's always a little bit of social commentary in them that I enjoy, but it's just a fascinating, I think, depiction of memories of 1950s, 1960s family life.
So 1830, Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act was passed, and therefore all indigenous peoples were forced west into Kansas, Oklahoma, and what was called the Indian Territory. Not long after that, Thomas McKinney and James Hall, they were publishers, and they decided they wanted to produce a book that would kind of preserve some images, some portraits of some of those prominent indigenous peoples before they were no longer, because they saw that's the way things were going. So they hired a number of artists, including Charles Bird King, to paint portraits, and then they turned all those portraits into lithographs. And between the late 1830s, early 1840s, they published a multi-volume book called The History of the Indian Tribes of North America. Of the 120 lithographs in that book, there were 5 that depicted natives that had a historical connection to Ohio, and that is these 5. They were all members of the Shawnee tribe, including the prophet, who is Tecumseh's brother. This is a piece of contemporary wampum designed and made by 2 citizens of Wyandot Nation. And it tells a story of how the Wyandot Nation's original collection of historic wampum was destroyed. In the 19th century, the army came into the chief's cabin, and they had a chest full of all the wampum, and they shredded it and just obliterated it. It was scattered to the winds. And of course, the tribe was understandably distraught. They gathered up what they could, and over the years, some of it has been repurposed, some of it has been repatriated to the tribe. But this is what these 2 Wyandot citizens have created to kind of tell that story and commemorate that story. And that's what you see as a Wyandot figure there, holding some shredded wampum and with other bits of wampum there on the floor. And so this was one of the highlights of this exhibition, was we got to work with citizens of various tribal entities, including Wyandot Nation. We had all these tribes that have historical connections to Ohio. This used to be their homeland. They don't live here anymore. I mean, there are certainly citizens who do, but their official tribal lands are now in Oklahoma and Kansas and other places in the West. And so looking for a connection to bring some of their stories back home to Ohio where they belong. This is the Tradition Gallery, and that's, again, tradition broadly defined. Ohio has a number of long-standing traditions: faith, education, travel, and tourism. So we tried to encapsulate as many of those in this as possible, which is why it looks a little bit of a hodgepodge, but it's a wonderful hodgepodge.
One of the things that I really enjoy are these beautiful pisanki eggs. They are a Ukrainian tradition. They go back before Christianity. They're just a beautiful design, intricately made. Ohio had a huge number of Ukrainian immigrants prior to the World Wars, but also that immigration increased as that region of Europe was destabilized. And a lot of them to Cleveland and were industry workers and settled in that area and have really contributed greatly to the cultural flavor of Cleveland in terms of food and religion and traditions.
One of my favorite objects in this room is the Millennium Falcon.
It's Millennium Falcon from Kenner's Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back collection. Action figures each sold separately.
George Lucas had a hard time selling Star Wars to any production companies. They just didn't think it would be much of a moneymaker. He ultimately found 20th Century Fox, and one of the parts of the deal was he took a much reduced salary in exchange for exclusive merchandising rights. Now, tie-ins with products had been a thing with TV and radio and all that, but not a significant tie-in. He thought they could change that. So he started shopping the idea around of merchandising toys to a bunch of toy companies. He finally found Kenner, a Cincinnati-based company, that helped him produce all the merchandising, all the toys. I was a little bit too young to be there on the ground, but apparently they sold out of everything they had produced within months of the opening of Star Wars in 1977, and it took a while for production to ramp up and get caught up. And since then, it's been more than 30 or 40 billion dollars of Star Wars merchandise from all the various movies and sequels. So this is the Change Gallery. Probably one of the most visible technological changes that everybody understands on a day-to-day basis is the history of transportation, and Ohio has played a role in that. The number of steamboats that were plying the Ohio in the 19th century is almost unimaginable. From steamboats, we went to all sorts of, there's canal boats, of course the Wright brothers. The Wright brothers' first flight in Kitty Hawk, December 1903. 65 and a half years later, Neil Armstrong, another Ohioan, landed on the moon. So in one short lifetime, we've gone from first mechanical flight to literally getting somebody on the moon and bringing them home, it says all you need to know about the innovation that happened here in Ohio. One of my favorite stories is a little felt mouse. You can imagine yourself being John Glenn on Friendship 7.
2, 1, 0, liftoff.
Godspeed, John Glenn. 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous.
Whizzing around the planet, the first human to do so at 17,000 miles an hour. He reaches into a bag and opens it up, and a little mouse floats out. And it was put there as a joke by Alan Shepard, because it related to a comedy bit from a comedian at the time about all the little mice that were, during the early rocketry studies, they would put mice and other animals in the nose cones to see how they would survive, acceleration and all that. And John Glenn always felt badly that no mice ever came back to Earth, so he was able to bring one back to Earth that had been to space.
Is it the actual?
It is the actual mouse that went to space on
Mouse
Friendship
who's
7.
been to space and back, one that actually made the complete trip.